Words have power, but the way we use them determines whether that power strengthens us or slowly drains our credibility. Many people believe that the more they explain themselves, the more they will be understood. They assume that if they just add one more sentence, one more detail, one more justification, the other person will finally see their point. But the opposite is often true. Over-explaining doesn't clarify your message. It dilutes it. When you over-explain, you unintentionally signal uncertainty. Your words begin to sound like you're asking for permission rather than stating a position. Instead of sounding confident, your message starts to feel defensive. And when people sense defensiveness, they often look for weaknesses in your argument rather than understanding the core of what you're saying. Think about the difference between a statement and a justification. A statement is simple and steady. It stands on its own. A justification keeps talking long after the point has already been made. It tries to convince, persuade, and protect itself at the same time. The problem is that every extra explanation gives someone new material to challenge. Imagine saying, "I won't be available tonight." That sentence is complete. It is clear. It communicates your decision without confusion. But when over-explaining begins, it sounds different. "I won't be available tonight because I've had a long week and I need to rest. And I also promised myself I would focus on some personal things. And honestly, I just need some time to recharge." The more you add, the more opportunities the other person has to question, persuade, or negotiate. They might respond, "It'll only take an hour," or "You can rest later," or "This is really important." Suddenly, the conversation becomes a debate that never needed to happen in the first place. Confidence in communication often comes from restraint, not from expansion. Strong communicators understand that clarity is not measured by the number of words spoken. It is measured by how clearly the message lands. Over-explaining also comes from a deeper place that many people don't notice. It often comes from the fear of being misunderstood, rejected, or judged. When someone feels this fear, they try to protect themselves with more information. They think if they explain enough, no one will criticize them. But communication is not about eliminating every possible criticism. It's about expressing your position with calm certainty. There will always be people who disagree. There will always be people who ask questions or challenge decisions. The goal is not to control every reaction. The goal is to communicate your position with clarity and then allow others to respond without feeling the need to defend every inch of your reasoning. Another problem with over-explaining is that it shifts the balance of the conversation. When you talk too much about your reasons, the focus moves away from the message and onto your emotional need to justify it. People begin analyzing your explanation instead of respecting your boundary. Concise communication restores that balance. When your words are simple and direct, they feel steady. They feel intentional. They create a sense that the decision has already been made. And when something sounds decided, people are far less likely to push against it. This does not mean becoming cold or dismissive. Clear communication can still be respectful and calm. In fact, the most respectful statements are often the simplest ones. They allow the other person to understand where you stand without feeling overwhelmed by unnecessary details. Another powerful tool in communication is silence. Many people feel uncomfortable with silence, so they rush to fill it. But silence is not weakness. Silence is space. It gives your words time to settle. It allows the other person to process what you said. When you make a clear statement and then stop talking, something interesting happens. Your words gain weight. They stand on their own. But when you immediately start explaining and expanding, you take that weight away. The message begins to wobble under the pressure of too many reasons. Over-explaining also teaches people how to challenge you. If every decision you make comes with a long explanation, others learn that persistence will eventually get more information or even a change in your stance. But when your communication becomes clear and consistent, people learn that your words mean exactly what they say. This is especially important when setting boundaries. Boundaries are not debates. They are statements of what you will or will not accept. When boundaries come with long explanations, they begin to feel negotiable. But when they are expressed clearly and calmly, they become much harder to challenge. Consider the difference between saying, "I can't help with that today because I already have too much work, and I've been overwhelmed lately, and I need to focus on my task," versus simply saying, "I'm not able to help with that today." The second version communicates the same message with far greater strength. Clear communication is not about saying less for the sake of saying less. It is about saying exactly what needs to be said and trusting that it is enough. Many people worry that being brief will make them sound rude. In reality, tone matters far more than length. A calm voice paired with clear words often feels more respectful than a long explanation that sounds anxious or defensive. Learning to stop over-explaining takes practice. It requires trusting that your words are sufficient without constant reinforcement. It requires becoming comfortable with the idea that not everyone needs every detail of your reasoning. And most importantly, it requires understanding that confidence is often quiet. It does not rush to defend itself. It does not scramble to justify every decision. It speaks clearly, then allows the message to stand. When your communication becomes concise, people begin to listen differently. They pay closer attention. They recognize that your words are intentional. They understand that when you speak, you mean exactly what you say. Over time, this changes the way others interact with you. Conversations become simpler. Boundaries become clearer. And your voice begins to carry a kind of quiet authority that does not depend on long explanations to be respected. The most powerful communicators in the room are rarely the ones who speak the most. They are the ones who know exactly when to stop talking. Authority in communication is not built by the number of words you use. It is built by the certainty behind them. Yet many people unknowingly weaken their own authority the moment they begin to over-explain. What starts as a simple statement quickly becomes a long chain of justifications, clarifications, and defensive details. The intention is usually good. People want to be understood. They want to avoid conflict. They want others to see their reasoning. But the moment a clear statement turns into an extended explanation, something subtle begins to shift in the dynamic of the conversation. The statement loses strength, and the conversation slowly turns into a debate that never needed to exist. When a person speaks with authority, their message stands on its own. It does not need layers of explanation to support it. It does not rely on emotional persuasion or excessive detail. It is clear, calm, and direct, but over-explaining sends a different signal. It suggests uncertainty. It suggests that the speaker is trying to convince rather than simply communicate. And when people sense that uncertainty, they often respond by questioning the message instead of respecting it. Imagine someone setting a simple boundary. They say, "I won't be able to attend the meeting tomorrow." That statement is complete. It is respectful and direct. But if the person begins to over-explain, the message starts to change. "I won't be able to attend the meeting tomorrow because I've had a really busy week, and I've been feeling exhausted, and I also have some personal responsibilities I need to take care of." Each additional sentence opens a new door for debate. Someone might respond, "The meeting will only take 30 minutes, or you can take care of your responsibilities afterward." Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about the decision. It becomes about the explanation. Over-explaining unintentionally invites negotiation. It provides extra material for others to analyze, question, and challenge. Instead of hearing the decision, people start examining the reasons behind it. And when the focus shifts to the reasons, the authority of the original statement begins to fade. This happens in professional environments, personal relationships, and everyday conversations. A manager who constantly explains every decision in excessive detail may believe they are being transparent, but they may also be unintentionally weakening their leadership presence. A person who justifies every boundary with a long explanation may believe they are being polite, but they may also be teaching others that their boundaries are negotiable. Strong communication does not rely on volume or length. It relies on clarity. Clear communication leaves little room for confusion because it focuses on the message rather than the defense of the message. When someone communicates with clarity, their words carry a quiet confidence. They do not rush to add extra sentences. They trust that what they said is enough. Another reason over-explaining weakens authority is because it often reveals emotional discomfort. When people feel nervous, guilty, or anxious about a decision, they tend to talk more. They try to soften the message with additional context or justification. But the more they talk, the more that emotional discomfort becomes visible. Instead of sounding confident, the message begins to sound defensive. Listeners are very sensitive to emotional cues in communication. When they hear uncertainty, they instinctively begin to test the limits of the statement. They may ask more questions, they may challenge the reasoning, they may try to persuade the speaker to change their mind. Not necessarily because they disagree with the decision, but because the communication itself sounded open to negotiation. Concise communication prevents this dynamic from forming. When a message is simple and steady, it leaves less room for interpretation. It communicates that the speaker has already considered their position and reached a conclusion. This does not mean being abrupt or dismissive. It means understanding that respect does not require endless explanation. There is also a psychological effect that happens when someone stops talking after making a clear statement. Silence gives the message weight. It allows the listener to absorb what was said. When a person immediately begins filling the silence with explanations, they interrupt that process. The message becomes diluted by the constant addition of new information. People often believe that explaining more will make their message stronger, but in reality the opposite is often true. The strongest messages are usually the simplest ones. They are delivered with calm certainty and followed by silence rather than justification. Overexplaining also changes the power balance in a conversation. When one person continues providing explanations, the other person becomes the evaluator of those explanations. The speaker is placed in a defensive position, constantly trying to prove the validity of their reasoning. The listener gains the role of judge, deciding whether the explanation is acceptable. Clear communication avoids this imbalance. It keeps the focus on the message rather than the justification. It signals that the statement is not a request for approval, but an expression of a decision or perspective. Learning to avoid overexplaining requires a shift in mindset. It requires trusting that your words do not need to be constantly defended. It requires accepting that some people may disagree or ask questions, and that disagreement does not mean your message was incomplete. When communication becomes more concise, conversations often become simpler and more respectful. People begin to recognize that your words carry intention. They understand that when you speak, you are not trying to convince them with endless reasoning. You are simply expressing your position with clarity. Over time, this clarity builds credibility. Others start to see that your statements are thoughtful and deliberate. They learn that your words are not temporary or negotiable simply because they are brief. In fact, the brevity becomes part of the authority itself. Authority in communication does not come from dominating a conversation with more words. It comes from knowing exactly what needs to be said and having the confidence to stop there. Confidence in communication is often misunderstood. Many people believe confidence means speaking loudly, using impressive vocabulary, or delivering long explanations that prove intelligence and preparation. But real confidence rarely sounds complicated. It sounds simple. Clear and simple statements communicate confidence because they show that the speaker knows exactly what they mean and does not feel the need to hide behind unnecessary words. When a person is truly certain about what they want to say, their message becomes direct. They do not circle around the point. They do not bury their meaning under layers of explanation. Instead, they present their thoughts in a way that is easy to understand. Simplicity signals control. It signals that the speaker has already done the internal work of organizing their thoughts and deciding what matters most. People often make the mistake of assuming that complexity sounds more intelligent. They believe that the more detailed and elaborate their explanation becomes, the more convincing they will appear. In reality, complexity often creates confusion. When a message becomes tangled in too many words, the listener has to work harder to understand the main idea. And when people struggle to understand, they begin to doubt the message itself. Clear communication removes that doubt. It creates a sense of stability in the conversation. When someone says exactly what they mean without hesitation, the listener can immediately recognize the direction of the message. There is no guessing, no decoding, and no searching for hidden meaning. The words land cleanly and directly. Think about the difference between two responses. One person says, "I might not be able to help with that today because I have a few other things that are taking priority and I'm trying to manage my time carefully." Another person says, "I'm not available to help today." Both responses communicate the same outcome, but the second response carries more confidence. It is not rude or dismissive. It is simply clear. Clarity removes unnecessary friction from conversations. When a message is simple, the listener understands it faster. They know where the boundary is, what the decision is, or what the request is. There is less room for misunderstanding because the message does not rely on complicated explanations. Another reason simple statements communicate confidence is that they reflect internal certainty. Before someone can speak clearly, they must first become clear within themselves. They must decide what they believe, what they want, or what they will accept. Once that internal decision is made, the external communication becomes easier. The words naturally become shorter because the mind is no longer searching for validation or reassurance. Uncertainty often creates long explanations. When someone feels unsure, they try to protect their statement with additional reasoning. They may add examples, justifications, and background information in an attempt to strengthen their position. But this often has the opposite effect. The more they explain, the more it sounds like they are asking for agreement rather than expressing a decision. Clear statements avoid that trap. They communicate that the speaker has already considered the situation and reached a conclusion. The listener senses that the message is intentional and grounded. Simplicity also strengthens credibility. When someone consistently communicates in a clear and straightforward way, people begin to trust their words. They recognize that the speaker values clarity over confusion and honesty over performance. Over time, this builds a reputation for reliability. In professional environments, clear communication is especially powerful. Leaders who speak with clarity reduce uncertainty for the people around them. Their teams understand expectations because those expectations are expressed directly. Instructions become easier to follow because they are not buried in long explanations. The same principle applies in personal relationships. Clear communication prevents unnecessary tension. When people know exactly what you mean, they are less likely to misinterpret your intentions. This reduces conflict and builds stronger understanding. Simple statements also give your voice a sense of calm authority. They show that you are not trying to overwhelm the conversation with words. Instead, you are guiding the conversation with intention. This calm authority often earns more respect than emotional or overly detailed communication. Another important element of confident communication is the ability to stop speaking once the message has been delivered. Many people feel uncomfortable with silence, so they immediately begin adding more information. But silence is often what allows a clear statement to carry its full impact. When you say something simple and then pause, your words have space to settle. Listeners often interpret that pause as confidence. It shows that you are not rushing to defend your statement or soften it with extra explanation. You trust that what you said is enough. Simple communication does not mean stripping away kindness or empathy. Tone still matters. A calm voice and respectful language ensure that your message remains considerate while still being direct. Confidence and kindness can exist together when communication is both clear and thoughtful. Over time, practicing clear and simple communication changes the way others interact with you. People begin to listen more carefully because they know your words will be direct and meaningful. Conversations become more efficient because the main point is delivered without unnecessary complexity. This style of communication also strengthens your own sense of self-trust. Each time you express a clear thought without overcomplicating it, you reinforce the belief that your voice is enough. You no longer feel the need to dress your ideas in elaborate explanations just to make them sound valid. Clear and simple statements do not try to impress, they aim to communicate. And in doing so, they often create a stronger impression than the most complicated explanation ever could. In communication, many people believe that power comes from speaking more, explaining more, and filling every pause with additional words. But some of the most powerful moments in a conversation happen after the words have already been spoken. Silence, when used intentionally, allows your message to settle in the mind of the listener. It creates space for your words to carry weight. When someone speaks clearly and then stops talking, the message gains strength because it is not diluted by unnecessary explanation. Most people feel uncomfortable with silence. The moment a pause appears in a conversation, they rush to fill it. They assume that if they stop talking, the other person might misunderstand, disagree, or judge them. This discomfort often leads to overexplaining. A person delivers their point, senses the silence that follows, and immediately begins adding more sentences to protect the message. In doing so, they unintentionally weaken the original statement. When you allow silence after speaking, you communicate something important without saying a single word. You signal confidence. You show that you trust what you just said. Instead of trying to convince the listener with additional arguments, you give the message the dignity of standing on its own. That quiet pause tells the other person that the statement was intentional and complete. Think about the difference between someone who makes a clear statement and then stops and someone who immediately begins explaining themselves. When a person stops speaking after their message, the listener naturally begins processing the information. Their mind focuses on what was said, but when the speaker continues talking, the listener's attention becomes divided. The message gets buried under layers of extra explanation and the impact begins to fade. Silence also shifts the dynamic of the conversation. When you keep talking, you take responsibility for carrying the entire interaction. The other person can simply listen while you continue explaining, but when you speak and then pause, you invite the other person to respond. The conversation becomes balanced instead of one-sided. This balance is especially important when setting boundaries or making decisions. If someone says, "I won't be able to attend," and then remains silent, the statement feels firm. The pause reinforces the idea that the decision has already been made. But if the speaker immediately begins explaining their reasons, the message begins to sound negotiable. The other person may start examining the explanation rather than accepting the decision. Silence prevents this shift from happening. It keeps the focus on the message itself rather than the reasoning behind it. The listener is left with the statement, not with a list of justifications to challenge. There is also a psychological effect that happens when people encounter silence. Humans naturally try to fill conversational gaps. When you stop talking after making a clear point, the other person often feels the urge to respond. That response may include agreement, clarification, or reflection on what you said. Your silence creates the space for their reaction to emerge. If you never allow that space, you remove the listener's opportunity to process and respond. Instead, the conversation becomes a stream of continuous explanation where the original point gradually loses its clarity. Silence also communicates emotional control. When someone can speak calmly and then pause without rushing to fill the space, it signals composure. The listener senses that the speaker is comfortable with the conversation and does not feel the need to chase validation or approval. Emotional control strengthens credibility. It shows that the speaker is not trying to dominate the conversation with words. Instead, they are guiding it with intention. The message becomes more memorable because it is delivered with restraint. Another important aspect of silence is that it encourages active listening. When you pause after speaking, you create an opportunity for the other person to engage more thoughtfully. They are not just reacting to a flood of words. They are responding to a clear message that has been given the time and space to settle. This kind of communication often leads to deeper understanding. People begin to listen more carefully because they recognize that your words are deliberate. They learn that when you speak, you will say what matters and then allow the conversation to breathe. Silence can also protect you from unnecessary conflict. When you stop talking after making a statement, you avoid adding emotional or defensive language that might escalate the situation. The message remains neutral and steady instead of becoming complicated by additional commentary. Many conflicts grow not because of the original statement, but because of the explanations that follow. Extra words often introduce emotional tone, assumptions, or justifications that were not present in the original message. Silence keeps the message clean and focused. Learning to use silence effectively requires patience. At first, the pause may feel uncomfortable. You might feel the urge to keep speaking just to ease the tension. But with practice, you begin to realize that silence is not emptiness, it is space. And that space gives your words the room they need to be fully heard. When you deliver a clear message and allow silence to follow, the listener has time to absorb the meaning. Your words become more deliberate, more memorable, and more impactful. Instead of being lost in a long stream of explanation, they stand alone with quiet strength. Many people believe that in order to set a boundary, they must first convince the other person that the boundary is reasonable. They feel responsible for providing detailed explanations, emotional context, and logical arguments to justify their decision. This instinct often comes from a desire to avoid conflict or to appear fair and considerate. But boundaries lose their strength when they depend on approval. A boundary does not require a detailed justification because its purpose is not to persuade others, it is to define what you will or will not accept. When someone believes they must justify a boundary, the conversation quickly shifts away from the boundary itself and toward the explanation behind it. Instead of focusing on the limit that has been set, the other person begins analyzing the reasoning. They question it, debate it, or search for weaknesses within it. What started as a clear limit turns into a discussion about whether the limit is valid. In this moment, the boundary quietly becomes negotiable. This happens because explanations invite evaluation. Once you provide detailed reasoning, the other person may feel entitled to challenge that reasoning. They might say the situation is different than you think, that your concern is unnecessary, or that your perspective is mistaken. Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about your limit, it is about whether your feelings or logic are correct. Boundaries were never meant to function this way. A boundary is a personal decision about behavior, time, energy, or access. It reflects what you are willing to participate in and what you are not. That decision does not require universal agreement in order to exist. Just as you cannot control another person's preferences, they cannot control the limits you choose to place around your own life. Detailed justification also creates emotional pressure. The more you explain, the more invested you become in making the other person understand. If they disagree or dismiss your explanation, you may feel the need to defend yourself further. Each additional explanation pulls you deeper into the conversation, turning a simple boundary into a prolonged debate. This cycle can become exhausting. Instead of protecting your energy, you spend it trying to make your limit acceptable to someone else. Ironically, the effort to avoid discomfort often produces more discomfort. The conversation grows longer, the tension increases, and the boundary becomes harder to maintain. Clear boundaries, on the other hand, are often brief and direct. They communicate the decision without attaching a lengthy narrative to it. A simple statement can be enough to define the limit. When the message is short and steady, there is less material available for argument. The focus stays on the decision rather than on the reasoning behind it. This approach also communicates confidence. When someone sets a boundary without over-explaining, it signals that the decision has already been made. The calm delivery suggests that the boundary is not an emotional reaction but a considered choice. Confidence often reduces resistance because it removes the sense that the limit might change under pressure. Another benefit of limiting justification is that it protects your privacy. Detailed explanations often reveal personal thoughts, vulnerabilities, or circumstances that you may not actually need to share. While openness can strengthen trust in healthy relationships, it can also create unnecessary exposure in situations where respect is uncertain. By keeping your explanation brief or even minimal, you maintain control over how much of your personal reasoning becomes part of the conversation. The boundary remains about behavior rather than about your internal life. It is important to recognize that boundaries are not punishments or attempts to control others. They are expressions of self-respect. They describe how you will respond when a situation conflicts with your well-being or values. Because of this, the boundary belongs to you. It is not something that must be approved, debated, or validated by another person. Many people struggle with this idea because they fear being seen as unfair or unreasonable. They worry that if they do not explain themselves thoroughly, the other person might feel hurt or confused. While empathy is valuable, it is not necessary to sacrifice clarity in order to maintain it. In fact, clarity often prevents misunderstandings. When a boundary is stated simply and calmly, the message is easier to understand. There are fewer words to interpret and fewer emotional layers to navigate. The listener hears the decision directly rather than trying to decode a complex explanation. Boundaries also become stronger through consistency. If you repeatedly provide detailed justification, the other person may come to expect a discussion each time the boundary appears. But when the message remains simple and consistent, the pattern becomes clear. Over time, people learn that the limit is stable. This consistency reduces the need for repeated conversations. Instead of revisiting the same explanations again and again, the boundary stands as a reliable reference point. The relationship adjusts around it rather than challenging it repeatedly. Learning to set boundaries without detailed justification requires a shift in mindset. It means recognizing that respect does not come from how well you defend your limits, but from how clearly you maintain them. When you stop trying to convince others that your boundary is reasonable, you free yourself from the burden of constant explanation. The boundary becomes what it was meant to be from the beginning, a quiet decision about how you will move through the world, expressed with clarity, steadiness, and self-respect. Respect often grows not from how much someone says, but from how clearly and directly they say it. In many conversations, people feel pressure to explain every detail, soften every statement, and fill every silence with more words. They believe that more explanation will make their message stronger or more acceptable. In reality, the opposite is often true. When communication becomes too long or overly detailed, the message loses clarity. Concise and direct communication carries a different kind of strength. It signals confidence, intention, and self-respect. When someone speaks concisely, their words feel deliberate. There is no unnecessary movement in the conversation. Each sentence serves a purpose, and because of that, people naturally pay closer attention. Listeners do not have to search through long explanations to understand the point being made. The message arrives clearly, and clarity itself creates authority. Direct communication also removes ambiguity. When people speak indirectly, they often leave space for misunderstanding. They hint at their needs rather than stating them, or they circle around the issue hoping the other person will interpret their meaning. This approach can create confusion and frustration. Concise and direct language eliminates that uncertainty. It tells the listener exactly what is being communicated without forcing them to guess. Another reason concise communication builds respect is that it shows emotional regulation. When someone becomes nervous or unsure, they often begin talking more. They add explanations, backtrack on statements, and try to cover every possible reaction before it happens. This can make their message feel uncertain. Direct communication shows the opposite. It suggests that the speaker is comfortable with their position and does not need to defend it with excessive words. People naturally trust those who appear steady and clear. When someone communicates with calm brevity, it gives the impression that their thoughts are organized and their intentions are settled. This stability often encourages others to treat their words with greater seriousness. Concise communication also respects the listener's attention. Time and focus are valuable resources. When someone expresses an idea in a clear and direct way, they demonstrate awareness of that value. They are not asking the listener to sort through unnecessary details. Instead, they present the message in a way that is efficient and easy to process. This consideration strengthens mutual respect in the interaction. Direct language also reduces opportunities for unnecessary conflict. Long explanations sometimes create more points of disagreement. Each additional sentence introduces a new idea that could be challenged or misunderstood. When communication remains focused and straightforward, there are fewer openings for the conversation to drift away from the main point. This does not mean that thoughtful discussion or context is always unnecessary. Some situations require deeper explanation. But even in those moments, clarity should guide the conversation. The difference lies in intention. Concise communication shares what is needed without adding words simply to fill space or defend the message. Another benefit of concise communication is that it strengthens boundaries. When someone sets a limit using clear and direct language, the boundary becomes easier to understand. A simple statement carries a sense of finality that long explanations often lack. The listener hears the message and recognizes that it is not an invitation for extended negotiation. Direct communication also encourages accountability. When words are clear, responsibilities become clearer as well. There is less room for misinterpretation about expectations, decisions, or commitments. This clarity helps relationships function more smoothly because everyone understands where things stand. Silence also plays an important role in concise communication. When someone finishes speaking and allows a moment of quiet, their words have space to settle. This pause shows that they are comfortable with what they have said. It signals confidence and prevents the message from being diluted by unnecessary additions. People who communicate concisely often appear more composed because they are not rushing to control every reaction in the room. They deliver their message and allow the conversation to unfold naturally. This calm approach tends to influence the emotional tone of the interaction, making it more balanced and respectful. Concise communication also helps the speaker stay aligned with their intentions. When messages become long and complicated, it is easy to lose track of the original point. Direct language keeps the focus steady. It prevents the conversation from drifting into explanations that weaken the message. Another reason respect grows from direct communication is that it reflects self-awareness. Someone who can express their thoughts simply has likely taken the time to understand them clearly. They know what they believe, what they need, and what they are willing to accept. That clarity is visible in the way they speak. Listeners often respond positively to this type of communication because it feels honest. There is no sense of manipulation, exaggeration, or hidden meaning. The message is delivered plainly, allowing the relationship to remain grounded in transparency. Over time, patterns of concise and direct communication shape how others interact with you. People begin to recognize that your words are intentional and meaningful. They learn that when you speak, you are not speaking just to fill space, but to share something important. This awareness naturally encourages more attentive listening and greater respect in return. Respect rarely grows from noise or excess explanation. It grows from clarity, steadiness, and the confidence to say exactly what needs to be said, no more and no less. When communication becomes concise and direct, words regain their weight, and conversations become more focused, purposeful, and meaningful.